Now, welcome to part 7 of my story that will, in a way, both carry on the Star Wars sequel trilogy or continue the journey of some of its characters, while also sort of rewriting or undoing the story of the sequels at the same time. Or, as I like to put it, this is a story of how what comes next will change what came before. And if you're new to the story or haven't seen the first several parts yet, I would highly recommend starting with part 1, and if you enjoy it, working your way back to this one. Otherwise, what is going on right now will make no sense to you whatsoever, and a link to the playlist can be found in the description below. And so now, without further ado, let's get back to the story. We begin in a medical facility, one we recognize to be Dr. Search's on the planet Elzuna, where a masked bounty hunter or mercenary is quickly and rather angrily marching through the halls, his head turning to and fro, looking down every hall and into every room. Until he comes upon a small lab of some kind that contains large glass tubes filled with these strange red spores that we've seen before on this planet, and where Dr. Search himself is carefully studying some sort of information on a datapad. The bounty hunter then immediately bursts into the room and demands, "What happened? How did the Imperials find him? How did they find the child?" Dr. Search takes another long moment or two to finish whatever he's looking over, before carefully and calmly setting the datapad aside and saying, "If you're asking if I betrayed you, rest assured I did not. The last thing I wanted was to lose my prized subject." Prized subject? The bounty hunter then removes his helmet and flings it aside, revealing the very angry face of an aged Poe Dameron, one who is maybe in his 60s. Poe then says, "How do I know you didn't tell the Imperials where he was, so you could go back to working for them, creating who knows what?" Dr. Search then gives something like a sad smile and says, "You almost make it sound like I chose to work for the Imperials, when in reality I secretly chose to do as little for them as I possibly could, while forcibly in their service." Poe then shakes his head, not exactly understanding, and so Dr. Search continues, "My fellow Kaminoan scientists and I only ever did enough to keep ourselves alive, no more, no less. Had it been otherwise, had we given them everything they wanted and asked from us, no rebellion would have stopped them, nothing would have." Poe then quickly responds, "And so what, you're a hero or something?" Dr. Search's face lights up a bit and he says, "You know, I never actually thought of it that way, but I do like the sound of it." Poe rolls his eyes and says, "Where were your heroics when they came for the child, for your prized subject?" Dr. Search replies, "Were they even needed? I thought the child got away." Poe says back, "Temporarily, they were tracked down by bounty hunters. Everyone's dead. The child's gone." "I see," Dr. Search says back, looking more disappointed than upset at that news. "Though one might almost think you'd be now tracking them down, instead of wasting your time here with me." Poe sighs. "I'm not even sure where to start looking for them. I thought maybe you'd know something." Dr. Search looks at Poe a bit sympathetically and says, "All I know are the names of the two that came here looking for him, or at least one of them was here for the child. The other, well, I wasn't entirely sure what to make of them." Poe quickly snaps back, "So you what, helped two Imperials?" Dr. Search shrugs. "They were infected by the spores and thus could provide me with valuable information and data. In return for that, you could say I saved their lives and let them be on their way." Poe shakes his head, but doesn't look all too surprised to hear that. He then says, "Don't suppose you got any names, or that they told you where they were going?" Dr. Search then says, "One was called Mara Jade, while the other simply called himself Finn. And he was certainly the more curious of the two, even claimed to be from the future." Poe's eyes go large. "What did you just say?" I know, sounds crazy, but he truly seemed to believe it. In fact," Poe then makes a wave of the hand as if to shush him, and then asks, "Where are they now?" Dr. Search then says, "I'm not entirely sure where they were headed, but they did take one of my shuttles. A shuttle that, of course, has a tracking device on it." That's when we're taken back to the planet Malachor, and back under the ruins of an ancient Sith temple, where Finn and Mara Jade have come upon what can only be described as a dark, dead underground forest, filled with gnarled old trees twisting their way out of a muddy ground. And by the light from their blue sabers, they saw strange, shadowy figures moving all about, before one masked figure spoke to them as he approached, a figure Mara Jade called Revan. Finn then says in response to her, keeping one eye on the figure moving towards them and the other looking to Mara, You know who this is? Mara, her eyes locked on Revan, shakes her head a bit and says, I know of him. He's a Sith legend, a story passed down by them for thousands of years. The figure, Revan, then lets out a bit of a chuckle and says, If I am only a Sith legend to you, then you have heard but one side of my story. For to some I am loved and hailed as a savior. Others fear and proclaim me conqueror. I have given and sacrificed, but I have also taken for no other reason than my own pure desire. Neither darkness nor light claim me, but I stand as master of both. Finn, almost as if he can't help himself, leans closer to Mara and says quietly, Is that supposed to be a riddle of some kind? Mara then shoots him her angriest look yet, before deactivating her saber, taking a step forward and towards Revan, and lowering her head and saying, We are not here to challenge a master of the Force, but instead we seek one who may have been lost on this world. Revan then stops moving forward and folds his arms across his chest before saying, You speak of Ahsoka Tano. Mara raises her head a bit, a glimmer of hope in her eyes as she says, You know her, she's been here. Know her? Revan responds, turning slightly to look over his shoulder, where another figure is quickly emerging from the darkness. She has been my student for some time, and is now one who seeks to understand the true nature of the Force, to wield its full power. Mara shakes her head a bit and says, Impossible. One cannot wield both sides of the Force at once. No more than one can traverse a river by going upstream and downstream at the same time. Revan turns back around to face Mara and says, I did not say true power of the Force comes from wielding both. Instead, it comes only from the darkness. It's at this moment that the approaching dark figure is revealed to be Ahsoka Tano, clad in dark black robes. In her hand are two ancient cross-guarded sabers. Finn, recognizing Ahsoka from the version of her he knows in the future, calls out her name, but the only response Ahsoka gives is to activate the sabers, crimson red blades springing to life. Revan then says, Now, my apprentice, it is time to show all that you have learned. Immediately Ahsoka, saber spinning, leaps towards Mara Jade, who quickly reignites her own saber, the blue saber created by Leia and brought back from the future by Finn, and blocks not only the first strike, but the rapid succession of swings that follow. At the same time, Finn raises his saber and makes like he's going to help to jump into the fray, but Ahsoka, not even looking at him, quickly and briefly reaches a hand out in his direction, force pushing him back into the nearest tree and knocking the wind out of him. That's when we're taken across the galaxy, where Ezra Bridger has just been awakened by a strange loth wolf that said the word doom, before quickly vanishing into nothingness. And so now Ezra finds himself in an underground cavern full of life and light, after, thanks to Thrawn bombarding him from orbit, tumbling down and through the surface of the strange gray world he's been stuck on for many long years, and where now he is face to face with a masked figure in white robes who has just called him Keeper, and who has just called himself Revan. Ezra, though, is still somewhat haunted by what just happened with the Loth Wolf, wondering if he imagined ever so briefly seeing it and hearing what it said, and so he says, almost more to himself than the one called Revan standing before him, I thought I heard the voice of my old master, just like I once heard on Lothal. You did, Revan responds. He is here, as he was there, or rather a part of him is, a remnant of who he once was, yet endures, as does a remnant of all who have ever been. They are still a part of the living Force. To that, Ezra shakes his head and says, No, when we die, we join with the cosmic. But Revan cuts him off and says, Yes, when we die, what we were again becomes a part of the cosmic Force, but a part of who we were remains behind and permeates the living Force forevermore. Ezra gives him a look of confusion, and so Revan continues, Think of it like an echo, one we all leave behind. For some, most who have ever lived, their echo is so quiet that it is little more than a faint whisper, lost within the great storm that is the living Force, never to be heard again, but still there. While for others, those strong with the Force like Jedi and Sith, the echo they leave behind is greater, louder, enough to be heard by one whose connection to the living Force is exceptionally strong, as yours is, Keeper. Ezra gives a bit of a frown and says, Why? Why do you keep calling me that? Why do the creatures of this planet call me that? And why am I only finding this place now? Would have been nice to find it when I first got here. He looks at a nearby tree where ripe, juicy fruit is hanging from a branch and says, I certainly would have been eating better. Imperial rations got old really quick. To that, Revan simply says, Rest assured, Keeper, the purpose of things will be revealed in time. Ezra again frowns and says, Well, can you at least tell me what this place is? I've never felt anything like it. Revan responds, It is a sort of gathering place. For you see, over the ages of this galaxy, the echoes of the dark and the light have been coalescing into two opposing powers. Revan then pauses and takes a moment to move towards the tree Ezra looked at before, pulls from it a piece of fruit and tosses it to him before saying, Thanks to my understanding of both the dark and the light, I first discovered this was happening many, many long years ago, that this gathering of echoes in the Force was taking place, and even then the power of both sides was great. Ezra takes a bite of the fruit, gives a look as if it's the best thing he's ever tasted, and Revan continues as Ezra eats with vigor. And so I knew I had to do something as they continued to grow stronger and stronger over the ages. I had to hide them, contain them, lest they be found and used. And so I created a place where they could forever do battle against each other, where there would be cycles of life and death, darkness and light, and two children to embody the powers while I kept them in balance. That's when Ezra finally speaks up again and says, Mortis, you're talking about Mortis. Revan looks at him and says, So, you already know of it. But Ezra shakes his head and says, So sort of. I've been seeing glimpses of it, heard whispers of it in both my dreams and in the world between worlds. There was also a mural I saw once at the temple on Lothal, one of a father and his two children. That's when it's like a light bulb going off in Ezra's head, and he looks at Revan and says, You're the father. Revan gives a single nod of the head and says, I am, or was. At long last I too died, and what you see before you now is but my own light side echo. Ezra shakes his head a bit confused and repeats, Light side echo? Revan then says, Yes, for there is also an echo of darkness. That's when we're taken back to Malachor, where we see a dark side Ahsoka doing battle with Mara Jade, and where Finn, after being knocked back into a tree, is slowly but surely coming to. And once he has his wits about him again, he first looks at Mara against Ahsoka, seems to consider going to help her, but then glances at the one called Revan, who, with arms still folded, is doing nothing more than quietly observing the fight. And so Finn, shaking his head as if he knows what he's about to do is not the best idea, he ignites his saber and charges at Revan. And while this is happening, Revan makes no sort of movement at all, as if he doesn't care or even see Finn is about to strike him down. And so Finn, much to his own surprise, which we can tell by a happy look of surprise on his face, raises his saber over his head and brings it down upon Revan, but it simply passes right through him. That's when, while Finn stands there dumbfounded, looking at his lightsaber and wondering if maybe something is wrong with it, Revan turns and seems to briefly look him over, as if noticing him for the first time, as if he couldn't have cared less about him before. Finally, after this brief inspection is over, Revan says, Curious, I didn't sense it at first, but your connection to the Force is uncanny. I wonder if... Revan then calls out in the direction of Ahsoka and says, That one is irrelevant. Kill this one. Immediately upon hearing the command, Ahsoka does a quick series of attacks against Mara, which ends in a force push that Mara is a fraction of a second too slow to block, and it sends her hurtling back into one of the gnarled old trees. With one hand then, Ahsoka pulls to her the saber that Mara dropped when making contact with a tree, while the other she raises up and makes a graceful series of motions with, and as she does, the branches of the tree Mara was launched into begin to come to life and wrap around her, restraining her. Ahsoka then turns and begins charging at Finn, two red sabers blazing. We're then taken back across the galaxy again, back to Ezra and the other Revan, the light side echo of him, and we hear Ezra ask, After you died, or the real you died, what happened to Mortis, to these powers? Where did they go? Revan responds, The dark side is ever selfish, while the light ever patient. Ezra shakes his head, not understanding, and so Revan explains. When the real me died, the powers of Mortis were released back into the living force, and Palpatine immediately sensed it, sensed this incredible darkness that had suddenly flooded into the galaxy, and so he began to seek it out. For many long years he searched, and when he found it, he learned it would not so simply lend its strength to him, not without first testing him, demanding he prove himself worthy of the full power of the dark side. Ezra then asks, and how would he do that? Revan responds, by turning a young Jedi by the name of Luke Skywalker to the dark side. That was the task asked of Palpatine. Though unknown to him, and too blinded by his own desire to see it, this dark side power had no real interest in him, not in Palpatine. It instead had its sights set on young Skywalker, son of the Chosen One, son of Anakin Skywalker, who was supposed to destroy the Sith and take my place within Mortis, balancing the two sides of this power that were continuing to grow. Revan then shakes his head almost wistfully and continues, but he refused to accept his true destiny. His attachments were too strong. He cared too much for them, for the ones he loved. They were all that truly mattered to him, and he would even risk the fate of the galaxy for them. That's when we're again taken back to Malachor, where we see Finn standing his ground and readying himself for Ahsoka's charging attack. And when she reaches him, she unleashes a quick flurry of attacks that Finn is amazed to be able to block with relative ease. He even inadvertently lets out a brief chuckle, which seems to infuriate Ahsoka, who makes another series of attacks that Finn is also able to block. When Ahsoka pauses, Finn quickly tries to disengage, to flat out run away from Ahsoka and towards where Mara is or was, though he's not sure of her exact location because of the almost complete darkness in the underground cavern. And so he calls out to her saying, "Going to need a little help here." And Mara yells back, sounding more than a little frustrated, "I'm this way, not that way." Finn then changes directions, and when he does, Ahsoka is upon him again, and she once more unleashes a barrage of attacks that once again he is amazed to be able to block. And this time he doesn't run from her. Instead, a look of sudden confidence on his face, he counterattacks with a series of swings, which, to his delight and surprise, begins to push back Ahsoka. We then are back with Ezra and hear him ask Revan, so if Palpatine felt and sought out this dark power, what happened to the light? Where'd that power go? Revan, seeing Ezra has devoured his first piece of fruit, motions towards the tree again, asking if he'd like another, and Ezra eagerly nods his head. Revan then grabs one and tosses it to Ezra before continuing. The light side, as I said, is patience. It knew the Jedi of the time had lost their way and become afraid that they would fail and fall to Palpatine, and so it waited, and when the time was right, and when it was needed, it would awaken in a champion, or perhaps champions. Ezra thinks a moment, then asks, why didn't it just choose Luke? I mean, if the dark side power wanted him, certainly it made sense for the light to choose this Jedi. Couldn't the son of the Chosen One with all this power easily defeat the darkness? I don't understand. Revan shakes his head a bit and explains, one must be careful about using the light for destruction, even to destroy the darkness. Ezra frowns and looks frustrated as he says back, how is the light ever supposed to win if the rules won't even allow it? Revan nods a bit as if he understands Ezra's frustration, then he explains, the light does have advantages that the darkness does not, for only the path of the light can lead to true immortality, to those who can retain themselves, their very being, when becoming one with the cosmic force, and when the ebbs and flows of the force allow it, and only when they allow it, they can come back and aid the living in impossible ways. That's when we're again taken back to Malachor, and we see Finn is still on the offensive, easily driving back Ahsoka. When he lets up for a moment, Ahsoka says, that combination, I know it. Where did you learn it from? Finn shrugs rather helplessly and says, only training I've ever gotten with this thing was from you, which I know doesn't make sense, but you have to trust me or believe me on this one. Finn, while talking about it, raises the saber slightly to show it to her and to imply he's just as confused as she is right now about what's going on. When Ahsoka sees it, though, when she finally looks closely at it, Her eyes lock upon it, upon the Skywalker saber, the one that once belonged to her master, Anakin Skywalker. Ahsoka then, just looking at it, at the saber, says, "Where? Where did you get that?" That's when we hear the voice of Anakin Skywalker say, You feeling alright, Snips?" And when Ahsoka takes her eyes off the saber and looks at Finn, it's not him she sees anymore, but instead it's her old master. Ahsoka then stares at him, half in disbelief, half in anger. She then strikes, swinging frantically at Anakin, who easily, almost lazily blocks and says, "Come on, I taught you better than this. How are you ever going to train your own student one day when your technique is this sloppy?" Ahsoka yells back, "You're not him. This is a trick of the Force, an illusion of some kind, a test of my new master." Anakin scoffs. "New master? I taught you everything I knew. What do you need a new master for? Knighted or not, you were already as good as any Jedi out there, except for maybe me." Ahsoka then shouts back, swinging her sabers as she does, "If I was so worthy, then why did the Jedi turn their back on me?" Anakin again lazily blocks all her attacks and then says when she's finished, "Really? Is that what this is about? Is that how we got to you, got into your head? I thought you'd gotten over all this, realized fear had gripped the Jedi Order. That's why they turned on you. Not because they didn't believe in you, but because they didn't believe in themselves anymore." Anakin then deactivates his saber and says, "Even still, I never gave up on you, Snips. Never could, never would. I always needed you. And I need you again now, maybe more than ever. Because you see, I can't stay long. In fact, I probably shouldn't have come here at all. Rules of time and space and all that. The cosmic force is kind of bound by them, in fact. But you know I've never been too good at following instructions." Ahsoka then lowers her red sabers and deactivates them, and Anakin continues, "Finn here, he's gonna need you. Need you to train him just like I once trained you. It's time for you to pass on what you learned. Others are going to need you too, like my son, Luke. A power is coming for him. A darkness unlike any other wants to claim him, and you gotta help him stop it. I'd do it, but I'm afraid I can't this time. Seems those laws of time and space aren't quite as easy to bend as orders from the Jedi Council." Ahsoka then shuts her eyes to fight back tears as she says, "But I'm no Jedi." Anakin simply responds, "Since when?" Ahsoka's eyes again open, and standing before her, looking utterly confused, is Finn holding the Skywalker saber. He then says, What just happened?" Ahsoka then gives him a grim smile and responds, "Questions later. Right now we have to get out of here." As soon as those words leave her mouth, the dark side echo of Revan, the figure of him, simply disappears, and the ground beneath their feet begins to shake violently, and cracks split in the muddy ground as trees begin to fall over. Finn and Ahsoka both then run to where Mara is wrapped up in tree branches, and they use their lightsabers to cut her free, before then fleeing towards the entrance, doing all they can to dodge chunks of falling debris as they go. Once outside, they find that it's not just underneath the temple that's shaking violently, but perhaps the whole planet is, and large cracks are opening up in the surface everywhere. Finn says this way to Ahsoka, pointing in the direction of where the shuttle they borrowed from Dr. Search is, and when it's in sight, and only about 100 paces away, a crack opens right under the shuttle, and it goes tumbling down into the nothingness. Finn then comments, "Guess we won't be returning it after all." Mara shoots him a look and says, "I think we have bigger things to worry about right now than that." She then looks at Ahsoka and asks, "Do you know another way off this planet?" But Ahsoka only shakes her head. The three then look around helplessly for a bit, until Finn points to the sky and says, "Look, a ship." Mara starts to say something about him having delusions of grandeur until she looks skyward and sees a small freighter of some type not only in the sky, but coming right towards them, and to her amazement, it even lands right by them and lowers its ramp as if inviting them on board. Not questioning it, the three run towards it and climb into the ship's small cargo hold. The freighter then takes flight just as a huge chunk of ground underneath gives way. And now they find themselves in a small, mostly empty cargo bay, all trying to catch their breath after the long run and harrowing experience. Finn, though, looks at Ahsoka, whose face seems distant, and he asks her, "Are you good?" It looks like Ahsoka starts to shake her head no, but stops herself and instead says, "I'm not sure. I feel like I've been gone for some time." Mara then chimes in, "That's an understatement," and this time it's Finn that gives her an annoyed look. He then asks Ahsoka, What happened to you? What was that place? But before she can answer, a door to the cargo hold slides open, and in walks a masked bounty hunter who seems to stop in his tracks the moment he lays eyes upon Finn. Either noticing that or maybe sensing something through the Force, Finn looks at the masked figure and says, Do I know you? At which point the figure removes his mask, revealing the face of Poe Dameron. That's when we're once again back with Ezra and the light side Revan, where we see Ezra seated cross-legged in some grass and munching on yet another piece of fruit. Confusion all over his face as he's trying to make sense of everything he's just learned. Suddenly, though, he drops the fruit, looks at Revan and says, Wait a second, where's Rey? Revan simply says back, They were not allowed in this place. Ezra then jumps to his feet, goes up to Revan and says, Well then where is she? That's when we're taken to space high above the planet and see an Imperial shuttle making its way for our Star Destroyer, the one we know to be Thrawn's new command ship. In the landing bay, we see Thrawn standing there calmly, hands folded behind his back, as the shuttle comes in for a landing. Moments later, the ramp lowers and a stormtrooper commander approaches Thrawn and says, Sorry, Admiral, we were unable to locate Ezra Bridger or any of his remains, but we did find something else. That's when Thrawn and the stormtrooper commander look to the ramp, and we see two other stormtroopers dragging an unconscious Rey off the shuttle. And that is where this part ends. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you thought of this part of the story and what you think might happen next. So leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.